Okay, so here we go. So this is a project, an illustration that was done for a tarot card. The tarot card, if you're familiar with tarot decks, is the Chariot. Now this particular deck is being produced by 78 Tarot, and I believe this is the 6th deck they've produced. And this is going to have a fantasy theme to it, so clearly we're going to break tradition with some of the normal subjects that are in it. Now, the art direction that I was given was we have sort of a lion tamer type character, 2 dragons, 1 red and 1 gold. Obviously, the card is the Chariot, so we have a few things that are built into that narrative. And I did a little research. I'm not a tarot expert, so I did a little research on the tarot card itself. There is some symbols that are in it. A hammer is generally depicted on the armor or on the chariot itself with this subject. There's also the suggestion of celestial influence, and in the traditional tarot card, there's a banner above the chariot that has stars on it to indicate this. In the piece that I did, I depicted it different ways, but with the sketch that they chose, it's shown through the lightning coming down. That's sort of the influence of the heavens there. Now, early on here, you can see, as I've been talking, I'm watching the black and white sketches start to develop. Now, all of this is done in Photoshop. I find most of the time that Photoshop is far more efficient for just making changes. And you'll see as I go through this, I'm able to clip out heads of the dragons, change their position, flip them, change the size of things. So it's just so much more flexible than, say, a traditional pencil drawing, which of course would require all of these things to be erased and started over, or an additional layer, a tracing paper, for example, layer, and have it redrawn. I like to work the sketches initially in black and white, and you'll see from time to time I have a palette pop up on the board that has 4 values, and there's also a value that's right off of white that's just the background of that, and it just allows me to get back to those exact values as I'm working, and that helps me to bracket the values so that I have the dark darks where I want them, the light lights where I want them, and I'm able to return to that palette pretty quickly by using that as my sort of color picker, I guess you could call it. So now through here, the sketches, my primary goal with any set of sketches is to exhaust what I feel are, the artistic options in design. It's not always to do the most beautiful drawing in the world. I mean, with any luck, that will come down the road. But right now, it's about trying to figure out, what compositions can work, what compositions don't work. And clearly you want to stay away from those. Sometimes finding out the direction you don't want to proceed is just as important as the direction that's going well that you do want to proceed. So, as I'm working through this, you can see I start to play with the anatomy of the dragons. I was only given the art direction that these were dragons, so there's not any specific look or design to them, and other than one's gold and one's red. So I did want to kind of change them up a little from one to the other, and I do believe that I even did some rendering on the sketchbook, and I don't know if there's any of it in the video, that I scanned those sketches in and started with that in some cases for these dragons. But as I get into this, you'll see, I mean, it just becomes It's a lot of things that are chopped together, moved around, the leg, the arm, playing with the anatomy as I see things sort of develop sometimes out of what I'm drawing. You know, sometimes the direction of the piece will guide it. It will guide you. You know, you'll do something and you'll see a different direction that can be taken. So those are all the things that I'm kind of thinking about here as I'm working through these very early preliminary stages. You know, and again, by the design of the dragon, you know, that I just mentioned before, you can see where I work with spikes more on the back. I don't know if I do them all with wings, but I mean, in the final, both do wind up with wings, but in the sketch phase, I'm just playing with different options to try and see, you know, what I like and what I don't like out of this. Clearly you want to develop, you know, something that you like, because we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this down the road, working out the anatomy further. Once I get a composition that I'm happy with, my next goal is to make sure that what I have down there can be understood by someone other than me, you know, and in most cases that means the art director. So, you know, there are things that I can loosely gesture in, and I've done enough times that I know what I'm doing. But that doesn't always mean that someone else looking in from the outside will know what I'm doing. So, you know, like I said, the next stage after coming up with a concept that I'm happy with is trying to convey that to the art director. At this point, I believe I think it's number 2. I'm not exactly sure which number it is, but the number 2 sketch, I believe, was chosen to go to final. And once I had that, I knew I was probably going to need a little bit of reference, especially for the front dragon, because there's some odd foreshortening in his shoulder and his arm that comes forward that I wanted to make sure, you know, I got right, you know, the angles and all that kind of thing. So what I did was I sculpted a small maquette. It's not, you know, it's not a perfect maquette or even really detailed by any stretch of the imagination, but you can see that it does give me some lighting and some form to follow and to draw by. And I put those up on my screen as I'm working into this. Now, I should also say that once this piece was chosen, you know, this particular image of the 3 choices that I gave to the client, this one was chosen. Now it's time to get in there and try and really hammer out the underdrawing before I go to oil. I don't want to resolve a lot of the drawing details. I don't want to make drastic changes while I'm in oil paint if I can help it. I'm looking a lot at the reference because that's real world stuff. You know, it's taking up space and being hit by real light. So it does show me a lot. But you can see that, you know, even still at this stage, I'll clip the head away, move things around. Again, the flexibility of the digital at this phase is just amazing. And one of the reasons why I prefer it over a traditional approach to the preliminary work, at least. Now, with this piece, as you'll see down the road, my intention here was to develop the underpainting digitally instead of going in with a brown underpainting. I wanted to develop this this was a little experimental, but I wanted to develop this in Photoshop and then give this a sepia tint to the color and print it out on, you know, on archival canvas, thus creating my underpainting digitally, which this was the first time that I had tried this approach on canvas. I've done it on mounted paper in the past. It works great. But I wanted to take it a little further and see if I could actually get this on canvas to work. So I'm my point in going through all that is that I'm taking the time to really develop the drawing of the dragon so that when I do print this out, it is pretty much the underpainting that I would have done, you know, in oil paint. I just happen to do this in Photoshop and then print this out in brown. So, or in tones of brown, values of brown. Now you can see that here, this is the print on canvas mounted down to 1/4 inch masonite, and then it has a few coats of matte medium applied over top of it to seal the canvas and the inks and all that kind of stuff, which are archival, but this seals them permanently. So now as I start to get into oil paint, you can see where, you know, I'm able to glaze. In this case, this is, I believe it's burnt sienna, but it has a tendency to look kind of like a middle red, or a dark to middle red. And right away, by just glazing over the established underpainting, which has the values so well established, you know, it starts to look like something right away. And that's what I like. My first kind of a goal or approach once I start painting is to cover the canvas and see if the palette's working. Now, as you'll see with this piece, it does go through a little bit of a change, which happens from time to time, but I start with the things that I know, which are the red dragon and the gold dragon. So, and then I'm going to kind of back into the rest of it, so to speak. Now, I don't know if we show it in the video, but I did also do a few color studies in Photoshop just to get myself in the ballpark. You know, I don't want to say I never just wing it and paint right into something, but most of the time I do some preliminary color study just to give myself a guide before I'm mixing the colors and things. And here you can see, you know, the background around the sword, the lightning, the orange, and then it transitions to sort of a gray-green color. This was my initial thought about this piece. It was going to be a little warmer. I think it was very effective for showing the light, for showing the you know, yellow, cad yellow is like light in a tube. It really can give the illusion of light. But down the road a little bit here, you'll see that I sort of changed my mind about that. But still, the value is correct. You know, the lightning is white. It gets quite a bit darker in the background than what I had established in the underpainting. So this first pass around it, as much as starting to lay in the color, is also building on the value that I have in the underpainting, the digital underpainting. You know, I'm going to call it the underpainting. And as I'm laying in these background values and things, you know, the paint is semi-transparent at this point. You know, I mean, you can see through it a little bit, so I don't have to be real careful painting around the dragon's head and that kind of stuff. If I paint outside the lines, so to speak, you know, that's okay. I can still kind of see underneath it, and I'll come back when I work on the dragon's head and clean that up. And as I'm painting behind this, you know, you can see I'm just moving around from one side to the other, trying to have the tones look like they carry behind the dragon, behind the figure, and have some consistency to them. You know, you don't want a certain color on one side of the painting and not have it appear anywhere else. That can look a little artificial sometimes. So, and you can see here there's some blue and some other things that are starting to go into this. And this was a different color scheme that I liked at first, and then I changed my mind, and I'll talk about why I changed my mind and what I didn't like about it. But primarily the value I thought was great. You know, that was working out fine. It definitely needed to be darker than, or the background needed to be darker than than what it was in the underpainting to move forward. But what I what I didn't like ultimately was the relationship between this and the red color. The red dragon just really stood out too much in my opinion. So ultimately I do change this over to more of a red violet background. But that happens, and the truth is that's why the lay-ins are an important stage, because I don't want to spend days and days rendering clouds or something like that and then realize that that didn't work at all. So once I cover most of the painting now with one layer of oil paint, you can see that I start to right away get into some of the meat of this thing, which is the gold dragon. I knew he was going to have a big highlight on the neck. Right there on the head is the focal element. So, I wanted to jump right in there and kind of see how I'm not really going for finish, but I just wanted to get in there, get some detail in there, get some more value in there so that I could see if the eye was being drawn in the right direction, in the right area. And it also gives me, again, the first chance to really get into the color a little bit. You can see where, I start to play around with the color of the chest plate a little bit is not gold. It's more of a whitish color. So we start to see those things develop a little bit at this point, even if they're going to be glazed into later. And altered a little bit, warmed up or cooled down, for example. I have to say that I love working on the heads of these dragons. I don't know why, but I just find it very interesting. They're all a little different, yet there's something similar about each one. I enjoy the anatomical challenge of coming up with these head designs, the shapes, the horns, and all that kind of stuff. And something else, as I'm watching this, I realize that this is more appropriate for the red dragon, but the horn that, as you're looking at the piece, the horn that's on his left actually started to look like the drawing was off, like it stuck out too far. So I don't know if this is all in there, but I do repaint that completely and move it around. So even at this phase, even with the defined and developed underpainting, that was done digitally, things can still be changed, can still be altered, just as they would if everything was done from a traditional, building up from a traditional underpainting. I mean, at this point, it is an oil painting in every sense of the word. So I peck around on on this gold dragon, and you can really see the difference now from the washes of color to some of the more orange color that's going into him. And even as it gets down to his legs, I know I'm going to want to play the value down. I'm going to want to go a little darker on the legs and things so that the knees don't stand out as much as the head, for example. I mean, that's a simple way of putting it. So in order to do that, I'm bracketing down the values as I get lower and lower on the gold dragon's body. One of my first things that I think about is just trying to get the anatomy right. I'm not really trying to paint any scales or anything yet. I'm just trying to get the form to look correct. And again, now here on the red guy's chest, you can start to see, even though primarily this dragon is just a wash over the underpainting, you can start to see how, it looks full color. Once I start to lay the chest plate in, it really starts to come to life. And I can put a little wash of color over some things like I did there on that arm, which allows me to work wet into wet. Which you'll see developing. Sometimes I will try and take a crack at the scales early on if I'm feeling confident, but a lot of times I just try and work the anatomy out, the muscles, the shoulder muscle, the bicep, the tricep, and all that kind of stuff. And then on the second pass, worry a little more about the secondary form, the scale pattern and texture and things like that. But it's also a matter at this point too, you can see where the chest plate is like a grayish brown color. I mean, it's cooler, has a little bit of, looks like it has a little bit of blue green in it, but that starts to break the palette up a little bit now. Everything's not so red on this guy. And I, at this point, also haven't used any real CAD red or anything like that. The values are bracketed down a little bit so that I have that CAD red as my highest highlight moving forward. And there you can see, now you can really get a sense of the color of this guy with the lower jaw blocked in, that there are two tones on his body. So now again on the wing, really just trying to focus more on the anatomy, the muscles of the wing, where the joints are in the skeletal portions of the wing, making sure that I'm setting myself up to have that hand pop forward. So I'm painting some dark behind that. Those are all the kinds of things I'm thinking about as I'm working on this area. I mean, it's kind of a simple area, but at the same time, I don't want to over detail it, and I don't want to under detail it. I want you to see the wing, see everything that you need to see, but we're also going to we want to look past it to the golden dragon in the back. Just hints of the cooler color, without so much of a defining line between the red and the cooler color like there is down the belly. In the wing, it's just more of an arbitrary use of color that I think makes it look a little more natural. I think most of this dragon, this guy, the size of him was pretty conducive to working with my filberts. I think it's a number 4 filbert. I'm not 100% sure. But again, I like those for this level of detail. I'm not into painting the teeth yet and that kind of stuff, so I don't really need a tiny round brush for the detail. I can get enough detail with the tip that I can get on the filbert, and I also like the filbert for painting scales. I just like the size of it. And I do have several different sizes of filberts that I use for different pieces, but this, I think, like I said, I think it's a number 4 filbert is one of my real go-to brushes. Now at this point, you can also see too that I'm laying in a yellow rim light, which I still was under the idea that this was going to be a yellow light, a yellow lightning. So that's something I change out, but I just, it's about creating the edges between the gold dragon and the red dragon, whether it's soft, hard edge, that kind of thing. Even though the color will change later on, it really is about the edge relationship that helps determine what you see, what you look past, what you look into on these things. So again, now with this back wing, you can see, and I can't even tell at this point, but I believe that back horn that I just mentioned a little bit ago on the red dragon has been moved and repainted. I'd have to look, but I did repaint that back horn. I remember that at some point. That kind of bugged me, and I got the eyes straightened out. It looked like we jumped forward on the head just a wee bit. And now, right there on the wing, you can see, what some CAD red going in there really looks like. Everything, even though he felt very red up until that point, when you see that very chromatic red go in, boy, it's a real boost. And of course, as always, I'm constantly turning these things on their side just to help you know, upside down, side to side, whatever I need to help facilitate the brush direction on these things. And again, there around the head of the dragon, the red dragon, you can see the rim light that, look, it wasn't on camera, but there was some work put into the head and that yellow rim light, which I changed to violet later on in the piece. But again, I want to stress that, you know, if you don't like the color, you know, it's not the end all that people think it is in oil paint. You know, if you don't like it, let it dry and paint over it or wipe it out, or, you know, whatever. There's a whole lot of ways to get around that until you get, you know, what you really want. So now this session that I'm working on here primarily was centered around the red dragon. So why I have those colors mixed up on the palette, I'm sure there's a string of reds, about 4 or 5 red colors. I wanted to finish out the knee and the foot, get the hand laid in and all that kind of stuff, and then just kind of see what I'm dealing with. You know, the first, again, I've said this before, the first pass is really just to lay it in and see what it is, and then after that, it's trying to correct it to finish, or at least that's my approach. Now you can see here where, you know, the leg had quite a bit of texture on it in the underpainting that I already had established with this chainmail pattern. So in spite of saying that I usually try and just lay in the muscles first, I do go in here and actually try and start to indicate a good bit of the scale texture on the upper leg especially. And something else I haven't mentioned, but I'm pretty sure that at this point I'm using liquid and linseed oil are my 2 mediums throughout the piece. Now early on in a traditional underpainting I'll use thinner, but I sort of get away from that by this point in the piece to keep the paint a little thicker. And again, you know, I said this about the gold dragon, but, you know, the values on his foot, on the red dragon now I'm talking about, you know, the red dragon's foot are bracketed down from the values that are on his upper body and head especially, because the upper body and head is really where I'm trying to draw the eye on this guy. So the foot is, you know, just painted in with maybe 2 or 3 values as opposed to the full value string that I would have used on the head. Now right there on the toes, you can see areas where I'm going to wipe out and try and correct the drawing around what the nails on the feet are doing. And that's, you know, an example of being able to change some things on the fly or in the process of it. Now I'm not overly concerned about patching the background there. You can see where, you know, the background is obviously, you know, been covered up and patched over, but I'm pretty sure at this point I started to realize that I was going to go with another color in the background. So I knew that I was going to make another pass on that background. So all I was really worried about establishing was getting the drawing, you know, the draftsmanship part of the red dragon in solid. If I had to patch in around the feet or anything else for that matter, you know, I don't have any problem doing that at all. I'll come back later and clean up the edge and the color that's in the negative space. Now with the hand, I'm playing a little game here because I have some, I'm indicating like a reflective light from underneath, the rim light from the top. You know, it's a lot of light on that hand. It's a couple little tricks to get it to jud forward in the composition, and at the same time trying to get the anatomy of the hands, the fingers, the little phalanges to have the, you know, look like they're the proper size, proportion, and the anatomical, you know, correctness of it is all there. So again, yeah, I just wanted to noodle around with that rim light, and you can see where, you know, I just get the canvas covered up now at this point. And the hand is completely in, we're completely painted in, and now we're down to correcting things, hopefully. Okay, so now you can see where I make some decisions about this background color. Now that I have the whole thing in, you know, all of the space covered, all of the underpainting covered with something, I can tell, you know, what I like and what I don't like. So the yellow is a very strong color in this piece, and it just, through sitting here and staring at it and working on it, I just decided that I was going to be better off going with a complement than the more neutral sort of gray green background that I had in there. So this is pretty much a violet, and then down at the bottom, one of my other concerns was that the red dragon really popped forward. Everything else did not as much. So this was a vehicle to help me have the red dragon settle into the piece a little bit, while some of the other things, you know, were going to have a greater impact. And you can see that as I lay in that lightning, when I change it over to white, you know, it still has the effect of light. It's the value that gives it that, more so than the color. You know, had the sky, for example, been very high key or a lighter value behind it, it wouldn't have looked as brilliant and wouldn't have looked as much like light. And that's something, again, that I sort of tweak throughout the piece. You know, this is now the first pass on this altered background color. And honestly, if I'd have known what I was doing, I would have made that violet color my first pass, but I didn't. So here we are. We're just kind of doing it again. But it's, you know, that's the nature of the beast sometimes. And so having said that, you know, I'm not trying to get this pass to be perfect. I'm just trying to get a color in there that I like, value in there that I like, get it to dry, and then I will go back in and reestablish clouds or whatever, you know, I'm going to put in the background. And I should also mention something I spoke about earlier in the is that there is a little hammer that you can see in the etching of the chariot itself. So that was also one of the symbols I had mentioned that was worked into this as a narrative element. But now, as soon as you get that violet around, you know, the head of that gold dragon, why, it really pops a lot more, and you know, to me, it just had a lot more impact. And at this point now, I was pretty happy, and I knew I was on the right path. You know, the technique around this lightning, you know, it goes from a white to, you know, a darker middle tone violet, trying to lay those colors in on the piece and then blend them rather than blending them on the painting is really the way to go, because it's very easy to have the the other colors influence the white. So, you know, a lot of times I'll just lay the colors down next to each other, blend them a little bit, but as you'll see here in a minute, I'll come back with a larger, very soft watercolor brush and blend down or dust down this background. Right now, it's just about getting the right colors and values down. I'm not really worried about blending them all that much at this point. Just trying to get the right players on the field, so to speak. I should also, you know, talk a little bit about, my influences, of course, are there's that large duster, I call it. You know, it's a very large watercolor brush, but as it softens all that down, and you can let that dry, and you know, or you can work back into it at that phase if you want. You know, this piece, anything with a chariot, you know, it reminds me, you know, there's a lot, of course, Frank Frazetta is a huge influence on myself and many other fantasy painters. He did a piece called The Silver Warrior, which I purposely stayed away from for a while because I know that piece so well, and I have it in my psyche, and I didn't want to copy it exactly, but I did, you know, I always revert back to some Frazetta somehow in these paintings. So certainly, you know, that Silver Warrior was an influence on this piece and this figure in particular. But even though this figure, you know, I drew this figure just from, I didn't have any reference initially, but I knew I was going to need something to help bring it to the level of reality I wanted. I do have some smaller armor models in my studio, so I do, and you'll see here, wind up photographing some of that and using that as reference, especially for the arm that's coming forward, which the foreshortening of that arm is the thing that would give me the most problems. So it was the thing I knew I was going to need some reference for. So now at this point, I think that's a small filbert, but I also will use some small rounds on this guy. This figure's, you know, it's not a huge figure. So, you know, we're definitely going to be into the smaller brushes at this point. And again, just like the other elements of the painting, it's about trying to cover that underpainting. Get the paint in, and then see where we're at that point. The arm on this guy, there's elements of aerial perspective being employed here, and you can see it in that back arm, especially where the back arm is painted almost with environmental colors to have it sink back into the lightning a little bit. And even though that's minor on the figure, you know, it's something I want to mention. It's something that I try and employ from time to time. Now, there are some shots of the little mini armor that I have. But the aerial perspective is something that I think about a lot. You know, it's something that will come into play even with the dragons themselves, the tails, the feet, the things that you want to kind of fall away, you know, a lot of times get influenced by the palette, you know, the environmental colors. Now with this guy, much like the dragons, you know, my first you know, goal is just to get the underpainting covered. Then after that, it's into etching in the armor and little snaps and straps and stuff like that. So, and I'd kind of let the hilt of the sword and the hand get mucked under the underpainting as I was painting around there. So I wanted to get that reestablished here. And he's starting to look pretty good. I mean, he's coming together. It's not that often. I mean, I didn't have a face, but it's not that often that I work a figure with almost no reference like this. So I was pretty happy with the way he was coming together. I had that the back shoulder armor was giving me some problems, and I wasn't quite sure that that looked right. And you'll see that as we move forward, sometimes the solution is to eliminate the problem. And my solution was just to cover it with the cloth, the cape, which you'll see. I don't know if we show it in the video, but I did try and make a few. I made an attempt at trying to get that armor right, but it didn't feel like I ever got it correct for that pose. So, sometimes you just need to get it out of there. So that's the approach. But you can see here where I pick around, and those little highlights on the armor, especially on that arm coming forward, are things that I was able to see from the reference. The little highlights and stuff, they really help. So now we're getting into some finish at this point. And as much as I'm getting into the etching and that kind of stuff on this, on the armor, I want the cape to be kind of loose. I want to paint it a little looser because it's in motion, it's in the air, it can look a little blurry. I don't want the edges, especially the ones that come up there around his head, to be sharper than the edges on the helmet. I want the helmet to pop forward. And we're really splitting hairs here, but I want those edges to be a little bit softer and a little more blended than the edges that are in the etching and in the helmet and that kind of thing. That's where I really want the tightest part of this figure anyway to be. I thought about making the cape more of a color, a violet, some kind of a royal color, or red or whatever, but ultimately I felt like that was going to be a mistake, and I like the black sort of, it is a very dark version of the environmental colors, so I knew it would work, but I think it adds a lot of punch. And again, you can see by using the environmental colors, the violet and that kind of stuff, it gives me the highlights and the ability to push it back behind the head there, where under the arm, it's much, much darker. Okay, now the bottom part here, this was the part that, honestly, it gave me the most trouble. Not trouble in painting it, but just trouble in figuring out what I was doing. So I had the violet palette, but I knew I was going to need something more than just a gradation behind these two dragons. The two dragons and the way they overlay over each other, and you can see at this point that there's two. The red dragon has two tails. They go in two different directions, and I like the one going down. I didn't like the one going behind the red dragon. That didn't work out the way I had hoped. So I'm going to just paint that out. But my point here is that I knew I was going to need in the value, I was going to need a good amount of variety so that I could push and pull the things forward that I wanted to have come forward, and then the things that I didn't want to have get real busy, I would be able to play similar values to things and have them kind of fall in the back a little bit. So I went with this sort of warm, kind of pinkish cloud color. And I thought that was a great solution. Now, with the gold dragon here, he's laid in like a yellow and orange and that kind of stuff. But a lot of times in yellow, dark yellow can go green instead of going brown. And I wanted to start to see some of those colors in this, because we're really, at this point, I've got the most of it laid in. I've got it laid into where I'm pretty happy with the way the palette's moving forward. So now I'm really looking to try and get things to finish. This might not be the final pass, but we're coming up on that. So I'm trying to get a nice metallic look to the skin. I knew I wanted that highlight right there on the head, on the neck. That would really make that head pop quite a bit. But those green tones also break it up just so it doesn't feel so monochromatically orange and yellow, I should say. And also, you know, with the dragon, with the yellow dragon especially, because it was so high key, or the golden dragon, I really stayed away from the darks until this point, because I knew they would be very minimal and I didn't want to get muddy and, you know, have all these heavy darks in there. So you can see there around the mouth, I'm working around the tongue. It's just a lot of little linear details that's starting to pull that head to finish. Everything else is a fairly light value on him. And that's anytime you're painting anything that's really high key. You know, the darks are used very sparingly, but they have to be there to show the full range of values. So you have to have them there somewhere. You know, I mean, I'll get in there and peck a little dark in the mouth for sure. And as this comes down, like the neck comes down here and gets to the rim light, meets up with the rim light on the red dragon, you can see where I'll start to go with a slightly darker value. Not real dark, but just one down on the palette or so that that rim light will pop forward on the neck. You can kind of see that starting to work itself out here. And again, like I said this earlier, but you know, now that we have the bicep and the you know, the shoulder muscle, the deltoid, and all that kind of stuff established, now I can get in there and play around with putting some scale patterns over top of it. Now that I know that the big form is correct. And a lot of this kind of stuff, you know, the muscles, trying to get the scale patterns to look right. This is just putting the time in. But you can see where, you know, on the bicep there, I'm trying to come up with the same sort of feel that the scales have on the neck, which is every scale is not outlined completely. The edges and the shapes of these things sort of, they show up and they dissipate a little bit here and there. And again, you know, you can see the darks on the chest, how kind of minimal they are. They're just little linear elements. Yeah, and this arm, the lower arm on the gold dragon, and that little bit of wing that you see underneath that arm, you know, there are two areas, you know, that are the kind of thing that I was mentioning before, where, you know, the anatomy of them needs to look correct, but they also have to have a relationship with the things around them that work in this piece, so that things don't get busy. I'll have the rim light on the red wing to deal with, and here you can see where right behind the horns on the red guy's head, you know, I'll kind of play around a little more with trying to get that value just bracketed down a little bit, so that the rim light that ultimately will fall on the red guy's head really has a nice punch and pulls him forward. I don't have any problem with the yellow standing out. You know, it's a big yellow dragon. It has plenty of punch. Okay, now back over to this background. Now the background that's in there now is dry. So I'm working over this wet into dry. I like the clouds that I had in there, and I thought that they did what I needed them to do. And you can see where the value gets a little darker down around the feet of the red dragon. So that helps the feet not stand out. You know, this back hand of the red dragon was something I didn't need it to stand out a tremendous amount. So I have values that are a little closer in the background to that. But in addition to that, I wanted to punch up the chromatic nature of the light on the clouds and go with something that was a little redder. I think it helped. You know, as I said before, the red guy really stood out to me, especially with the color that I started with in this background, that sort of more neutral gray-green, with the red, or the, the pink and the red of him and all that, it puts them all in the same kind of family. So he, to me, feels like he sits in that environment more successfully. I have to say, I enjoy painting clouds too, and there's some rules about them that I've made up over the years, edges and different things. Maybe we'll save that for another video. But I'm trying to work on this in kind of sections to stay ahead of the paint tacking up on me, so that I'm working all wet into wet, essentially. I mean, the underlayer is dry, but I'm able to lay this whole thing in, then kind of noodle it around almost to finish, except for just a few finishing touches, and have the control, keep control of it that way. If I laid the whole piece background in, it would start to tack up a little bit with an area that big. And the way this thing's designed, I'm able to work on sections that are sort of broken up, that aren't all one big continuous area. And you can see here now, we've stepped ahead a little bit, but the rim light on the dragon, on the red dragon especially now, is no longer real yellow. I already made one pass on it to tone that yellow down, but I can see where it's going now, because I have that lightning color, that white violet lightning color, and that's what the rim light's going to be. You can see where on the hand it's still yellow. The old tail that used to go behind the gold dragon is gone now. So things are starting to come together a little bit. At this point, it's about taking it to the finish line. I feel like I've resolved most of my issues at this point. It's just a matter of technically finishing this piece up. And that's easier said than done, by the way. That sounds like nothing, but that's, you can make it or break it during that part. I did start to feel like it got a little dark at the bottom, and I believe I do. Yeah, I start to work in a lighter value. And you can see I just wipe out some of that red, and I do that because that red is so punchy. It mixes with the colors as I put them down, and I didn't want it to overly influence this violet going into it. So I keep a bunch of rags around, and if you really need to strategically remove something, you can go in there with thinner on a clean brush and sort of wipe out the oil paint that you've put down, kind of paint in reverse. Now up here again, the upper part, the figure's dry at this point. The background there is dry, and my reason for going back into this upper part here now is that I had the bottom established much more than I did earlier on when I blocked this in from the yellow. So now it's just a matter of creating continuity between the lower and the upper portion. The lightning, I'm not looking to really change, although I'm sure that I kind of paint into it a little bit. But again, the darker the value is around the light source, around the lightning itself, the more that looks like light. So now, and then here we are with this red again, with the red dragon, the red sky. It was a real game of inches. I felt like, I did a little bit, then I would glaze into it a little more. I don't know that I would have felt comfortable or even been able to get this background finished to this level had I known these colors and went into them great guns right out of the gate. I think this had to be a building process. Some pieces are like that. Some pieces you can see it right from the beginning. Sometimes it takes a little while to develop, the way the thing's going to go. Yeah, these big areas, they were nice. They were just a little too dark. So we'll get everything painted in, dusted down. You know, that's a big part of the cloud painting for me. And you don't have to dust them down to the point where you don't see the brushwork in it. But the one thing that does help is the brushwork and the detail that are on the figures will judge forward if the background is softer and out of focus. So that's just a little trick to help create the illusion of depth. And that there, the brush there, that's a larger filbert, you know, that I use. I like doing for that. And then there's my go-to duster. And it's amazing how, you know, it can look kind of chewed in and slopped in before that, but once you dust it down, it all comes together. When I dust it down, you can see, you know, I'll wind up with a little it going over the edges of the dragon and stuff like that, and that's just things I'll come back and clean up later. It'll give it a nice sharp look on the figures themselves. The figures, by the figures I mean the dragons. And now here we are, when I really put this light in the bottom, you know, you can really see why I lightened that up so much. But it helps, I think, just give it some depth. And now the background is really, you know, coming together. Took us a little while to get there, which happens from time to time. But I'm much happier with this palette than what I started with. Okay, now I don't remember whether the background is dry or I'm going to assume that background sky at this point is pretty dry, and it allows me to stay a little cleaner and sharper on the things that I paint over it, being the dragon and, you know, this hand in particular. So now it's about getting in, and, you know, everything's in, the form's in, the color's in. Now it's just a matter to get in here and sign off on it, you know, get it to a point where the detail looks finished. And again, now here's a chance to really, you know, get in a little color, which was not to make the tongue pink. I don't know why, but I like purple tongues on dragons. I think there's some lizards in reality that have these crazy colors, and I always find that stuff interesting. So, especially since we have some violet in the background of this piece, I think it was a good choice. So, and again, this is just noodling over it, putting in the time, trying to get the drawing right. You know, we know that the jaw is that neutral sort of gray brown color. The teeth are going to have a little bit of that. You know, there'll be a little bit of violet in here. So there's some art. I wouldn't call them arbitrary. I mean, the palette of that tongue is pretty chromatic. But there's a couple little colors that are just being plucked off the palette, dark brown reds and stuff like that. So, but this is one of the detail areas. I mean, the head is a space where you're definitely going to want to put some time into. I mean, I like to spend time on the heads, as I've mentioned, and I mean, it's not just dragons, but even when I'm painting human figures, human characters, you know, the portraits I think are important. And it's something that people look at and relate to. So it's definitely something you want to make sure your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. But you can see here how, you know, I'm not going to repaint this head, but I'm going to go in and accent the darks, you know, around the horns, around the lower jaw and all that kind of stuff, and get this all straightened out. I think I realized that the teeth are a little too high in the skull, so I just paint them out and then I add them back in here in a minute. But it's really about, for me, it's about making sure the eyes are looking at you. I mean, that's always important, to get the eyes going in the right direction. Again, no matter what you're painting, whether it's a dragon or a person. And this is, you know, again, I mean, I've said it before, but this is, now we're not just laying it in and seeing what's happening. This is, you know, we're really trying to finish this thing at this point. You know, we're trying to get pretty close to, everything except maybe the wettest highlights, that you would need to work over this dry in order to achieve. That's my one of my small rounds too, is like, that's what I'm talking about. That's pretty much my detail brush, my go-to detail brush. When you put a real spindly little point on it, I mean, I can't imagine that you would need a smaller brush than that. I know people do use, 000s and 50s. I don't know whether I've just lost patience over the years or whether my eyes are going as I get older, but this is a number one round, and to me that's about as small as I need to go. And the tongue starts to develop some texture just by the little paint dabs that are on it, which is interesting. It's interesting to see. Now, you'll see here with this rim light, there's too much of the rim light on the head, so it actually needs to be made a little thinner. There needs to be less of it by starting with some values that are not the highest highlight, that are a little more in the mid-range of the string of color, to get that under control. And you can see it there, just when the wet, that white highlight goes on, it really has some impact. So you want to leave some impact there. You don't want to go with the highest highlight right away, because then you have nowhere to build to. But I definitely think that the violet rim light on this was more effective, especially when you see it with the red and the yellow, than had I done everything with the yellow rim light. With the yellow dragon, it was just too much yellow for this particular piece. It was a very dominating color. And again, with the teeth, I've kind of pecked around a few times, and I'm not using, that huge watercolor duster, but what I do is I use older filberts that basically don't keep their point anymore. They're shot for keep getting detail down, but they're soft brushes that are frayed out, and I'll use them as like little mini dusters over an area like the teeth. And again, I mentioned this before with the aerial perspective theory. Getting involved in things is that, I'm using that environmental color, that violet, and the more the horns that are running down a spine go back in the distance, the more I will employ that environmental palette. And it's a very minor thing here. I mean, you don't notice it as much, but it is still aerial perspective at play, and it's one of the things that's helping push parts of the dragon back. And again, the back wing there, where it meets that horn, you can see where I have that edge is a little softer. All of that's being considered while I'm tweaking this up, so that just everything looks like it's happening in the right order, the right level of distance from the viewer. And also, the fact that your eye hopefully goes to the right things. And there we go. That when I knock that highlight down on that horn, you can really see what I was talking about with being able to build the rim light back up. Now I can add little highlights, little points of light that help show where the horn turns and the form on that thing, rather than just having one real hard linear edge. And one more time, the value behind that is important. So I'm getting back in a little bit on the gold dragon, just to make sure that my highlights are going to pop and all that kind of stuff. And there you can really see the color relationship between the yellow and the violet. And you'll see it again when when I do the hand and eliminate the yellow rim light that's been on there since the beginning of the painting now. But again, flip them upside down, all around, whatever it takes to get, the brush direction is just something to me, it also helps just look at the thing on its side sometimes, just to get a different perspective of it. You'll see that I jump around quite a bit. And most of the time that's because as I'm working on the thing, I'll just notice other things about it, something about the upper horn that might need a little balance or correction. I started working on the lower jaw there and then kind of moved on to the head. There isn't really any rhyme or reason. I do try and stay in sort of general areas, generally controlled areas on the piece. But whatever works for you, I think, is really the mantra here. But now, now you can see where, I'll pop in some red highlights on that head, and it's really starting to come together. Now, I did redraw this wing at one point a little bit, and I knew that the rim light was going to be a little bit of a challenge on this guy here, on the wing being the guy there that I'm talking about. So this is really kind of the first pass that I'm redrawing some of this structure, redrawing it in paint, which I don't always like to do, but it worked in this case. It just needed a little something extra on the wing. And again, at this point, I have the palettes all pretty established. I know what the rim light palette is. I know what the dragon palette is, and even the environment around it if I needed to remix any of that. So it's not really a matter of trying to figure out the color at all or anything like that. This is, now we're really into, the finish of it. And from the look of it, it looks that I'm painting wet into dry. The wing that's there has long been dried. Now here's a case where I thought I was gonna play around with a little light inside the wing, the wing being a translucent light, but once I lay that in, I didn't care for it as much, so I wind up beating that down and keeping it a little darker. And again, that's just kind of sometimes you gotta try it and see what works. I could have done this digitally. I could have done like a little mock-up digitally just to see if it worked first, but at this point I was moving along on this pretty good, and I figured if I didn't like it, I could always just wipe it out. Sometimes painting the wings on a dragon, the challenging thing that I find about them is that there's a tendency to want to draw them in the same position all the time, in essentially what looks like a Batman logo. So trying to get them to turn and have the form and all of the, the bone, the skeletal design, that can be a challenge. I look at a lot of bat reference when I am designing these things, but a dragon's wing is really just based on that. It can be quite different from a bat, but it's still kind of the same principle. So we have these spines and this sort of leathery, in between membrane that's stretched, and I don't know. For me, I always find that challenging, more so than the heads on the dragons. The dragon heads, I always enjoy working on. The wings, when I like them, but sometimes they can be the bane of the job. Once I get them designed, then I feel okay. Like if at this stage I've committed to some things, but especially when I'm in the sketches in that early digital stage, I try and go all kinds of crazy ways just to see if there's something I haven't thought of yet. I've done so many dragons over the years that sometimes I feel like I'm repeating myself, and I want to try and stay away from that if I can. And again, I think this is the last little, oh, and it's not the hand. I see the hand there. The rim light on the wing and the rim light on that hand coming forward of the red dragon, they're the two little bits of rim light that are left that haven't had the environmental palette employed on them yet, but they will, and we'll see that get cleaned up. And you can see as I'm painting over that dragon's wing, and this happens a lot in the way that I work and working in layers like this, is that really the value and the color isn't changing too much. It's getting a little richer. It's, the colors are a little more chromatic. I can be more supremely confident in that palette now because I've sort of taken baby steps to get to it. Now I'm at the finish line, pretty close to it. So I know what all these colors are, and I can really go in and use them more, in a more confident way. And you can see there too where the value of that rim light, really changed a lot. What I had laid in earlier on was just one value. It was a very light value. Now here I'm using about 3 or 4 different values of violet, and I'm able to darken it down as it approaches the edge of the painting there. I don't want the real highlight on the edge of the wing, out towards the edge of the painting. I don't want there to be, I don't want that area to draw your eye that much. So here we are. Here's a better look at the piece as a whole. And this is probably a session or two later where what I did correct in the drawing of that back wing is now dry. So I'm at least confident that I have that. And the one thing that I like about working that way is as I'm working on this, if I get something that I don't like, I can always just take a rag and wipe it back to the dried version. It's sort of the closest thing to being able to remove a layer like you would in Photoshop that you'll find in oil paint. But it's sort of why I work the way I do. I get it so far, let it dry, and then I can move forward, but I know I can at least get back to that point. It's just a little bit of a safety net, a technique I've developed over the years. But now you can see where, what was there looked okay, but now I'm really getting into tweaking this a little bit. And of course, the one thing we'll have to realize is that, that dragon, and he will, but that red dragon, he needs some teeth. He needs some teeth in the top. He looks like Grandpa Dragon there, getting ready to gum you to death. But now, after all the discussion, you can see how the rim light changes throughout the piece. Some areas it's softer, some areas it's a harder edge, some areas, it's a real high highlight. Some areas it drops down to a middle tone violet. So, even though it's this real sharp rim light, it still has quite a bit of difference, in it to help control what we're seeing and where we're looking. But at this point now, we're in tweaking the golden dragon. I mean, and this is getting down to the nitty gritty here. We're in the detail phase. Everything from across the room, one of my painting mentors used to say to me, well, if you back up and you can look at it from across the room and it doesn't change, then you're on the right track. You're getting close to finish. So, and that's really where I'm at with this. It's not these aren't radical changes. These are all small drawing changes, or just cleaning up areas, bringing them to a higher level of craftsmanship, and to finish, and then we can call it done. But there's not going to be any more radical reconstruction like the changing of the palette in the sky or that kind of thing. Yeah, all of this, and you can see now, like the belly of the gold dragon, it'll just be little pings of detail, things that will enhance the form a little bit. We'll really get into some darks on the mouth, but it's pretty minor. I mean, this guy, he's been 75 to 80% of the way done for a while now. So it's really just the little bits of finish that we're in here trying to do. I think that's important to keep in mind, though, because sometimes it can seem overwhelming, especially at the end of a painting like this, where I've got a week or 10 days in the painting process, and you've just been looking at this thing forever. And you have to keep in mind what your goals are. You're not trying to build Rome in a day. A lot of times it's, they're just little details, and it's just keep that in mind. And I think that you can move forward more efficiently without feeling overwhelmed on something that's like a bigger project like this. Here we go. He looks better already with a few teeth. Looks a little meaner. And I guess we didn't show it, but I keep mentioning it. But the rim light on the hand now is violet. All of the rim light now is the same, and this is really we're not too far from a signature at this point. When you're in, putting highlights on the teeth, you're hopefully getting pretty close to finish. And again, the same thing, with this main figure, which is basically he's in there. This is just about noodling the little details to a point that I'm happy with the craftsmanship. And that's a personal choice. Some painters stay very loose. Some guys paint to the point where you can't see brushstrokes. That is just so personal that, that's up to you to make that decision. But you'll see where that goes for me. And you can also see at this point where, one of my solution with that back shoulder that I talked about earlier in this piece was just to cover it with the cape, which I think looked great and worked out really well. All of the form, as I've talked about before, all of the form is in there and looking pretty correct. The light on the shoulder, all that kind of stuff, the volume of the armor. So we're really just in there now, etching, noodling the little details, making sure there's highlights on the buckles and what have you. These are the highest highlights and details that you're going to put in it, and we're about to call it done. A little bit of gold trim too. I wanted to use the gold a little because I wanted to not just get the yellow up into him a little bit compositionally, but it's an opportunity to highlight this hammer that's on the face of the chariot itself. The square within the hammer, it wasn't necessarily within the hammer, but a square was a symbol of the element earth, which was also something I came across in my research of the traditional tarot cards. And even though I dark it up here again, darken it up a little bit, you can see that the aerial perspective is really at play with that back arm. You could call it aerial perspective. It's being immersed in the light of the glow of the sword and the lightning hitting the sword and all that kind of stuff. And the lightning at the end it's a very linear thing at the end once you get the glow and all that in. But I knew I wanted to come back and paint that lightning with the background dry, just so that I could get a nice sharp line. And there we go. The Chariot.